Thanks, everybody. My name is Rajiv Ravulapati. What a great turnout for a virtual webinar at 2 o'clock Central Time on a Thursday. As you guys continue to come in, we're going to hit you with a poll. We just want to get to know you as we get to let you know who IMT is today, just letting us know what industry you're in and what you represent in terms of trying to decarbonize buildings. So you guys are all here today to talk about building performance standards, better buildings for everyone. I know that a lot of people on this call today are already familiar with BPS, but for those who are maybe this is their first time knowing it, a BPS policy is a set of standards designed to reduce carbon emissions in buildings by reducing energy and water use and cutting peak demand. BPS policies are unique, and they are the most powerful way to decarbonize existing buildings. So the people that are working here at IMT, the people who are on today's webinar, you guys all represent changing the landscape. We're so grateful for your time, your passion, your commitment to an equitable BPS. So thank you again for joining today. So I'm going to go over real quickly our presenters for today. Again, my name is Rajiv Ravulapati. I am IMT's Senior Manager for Government Engagement. And I'm based out of St. Louis, Missouri. And before joining IMT, I worked the past 5 years for the city of St. Louis. I worked in their building division, and I was the lead on developing their BPS policy as well as implementing it. And it was during that time is when I was first exposed to IMT, and I met the next gentleman I'm about to introduce, Cliff Majersik. He's our senior advisor here at IMT. He's based in DC, where IMT is headquartered. And if you work on IMT, you're bound to meet Cliff. I like to call him the godfather of BPS. Also, I've got Ben Silverman. He's our manager for policy design and implementation. Ben's based out of Boston. And similar to me, Ben was the technical lead on the development of BPS when he worked for the city of Boston. And lastly, we've got Marla Thalheimer. She's our senior director for business engagement, and she is based in Nashville, Tennessee, and leads our business engagement team. Besides these presenters, behind the scenes today, we've got also two of my other colleagues, Jessica Miller, who does a lot of work on our BPS and will be monitoring the Q&A for today's Zoom, and my colleague James, who will be kind of our hype man and dropping a lot of links and helpful info that wasn't in our slides today. And momentarily, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker from the White House Climate Policy Office, Heather Clark. So again, thanks everybody for joining today. We really appreciate it. I want to express our gratitude for the turnout, and also to give you IMT's understanding of BPS over the years, including the recent development of our BPS Implementation Guide, which is the impetus of all the work that we've done for the past couple of years and the impetus for this webinar today. And today is the first of a series of webinars focused on specifically BPS implementation. We talk about it in depth, 90 pages to be exact, in our guide, which we'll send out later today after today's webinar. But as you see on the slide right here, we're going to do deeper dives throughout the year about specific topics. But it's really important that we as an organization understand and want to hear what topics are on your mind, and so we can figure out how we can be the most resourceful and valuable to the jurisdictions, businesses, and community that are interested and invested in a BPS. So I also want to end with the fact that we're never done with this work. With your feedback, we're constantly refining our recommendations and continuing to facilitate conversations among jurisdictions and all partners. And we continue to work with cities who are doing BPS right now, like St. Louis, Boston, DC, the state of Colorado, and those who are curious and ready to start implementing BPS. So this is our agenda today. We're going to be kind of covering a lot of different areas at a very high level and going into the general strategies and principles and guidelines for a lot of the topics that you see here today. But again, we go into a much deeper dive in our BPS implementation guide, where we can work with you after today's webinar and get more feedback on how we can refine our own approach. Before we dive right into it, we're going to try and do our due diligence and end our presentation around the 40-minute mark, so we can then take questions. But if you do have questions that do come up as we're presenting, just go ahead and enter them in the Q&A, and our colleagues will be working to answer them as they go. But we'll also pull out some questions at the end to also discuss during our Q&A section. So I want to introduce Heather Clark. She is the Director for Building Emissions for the Office of Climate Policy at the White House. And she's got two passions over the course of her career: curbing the climate crisis and creating more affordable housing. She spearheaded the first large-scale deep energy retrofit in the US in Boston, 192 affordable apartments at Castle Square Apartments. And she's also served on the Massachusetts Energy Efficiency Advisory Council, as well as the Director of Rebuild America for NYSERDA, New York State Energy Research Development Authority. And also she's an award-winning visual artist, and she utilizes public art and large-scale interactive art installations to convey stories of social justice and the environment. Heather?
Great. Thank you for having me here. So I wanted to start by thanking all of you for being on this call from the White House. We are in the midst of a climate crisis, as we all know, and we cannot do this without you. We can't address this without you. We need to quickly and rapidly begin to move our buildings towards zero emissions. And it's because of you that are on this call and those folks that are on this map, some of them are also on this call, that we're going to be able to get there for our buildings. As you probably know, buildings contribute more than 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions. 10% of those emissions are coming from burning fossil fuels in our buildings, and an additional 6% of our national emissions are coming through construction materials and constructing our buildings. We need to start figuring out how to quickly and equitably move our buildings towards zero emissions. And building performance standards are a very, very effective way to do that. 80% of buildings that are here today are going to be here in 2050, and we need to figure out how to address them. So over a year ago, or maybe it was about a year ago, right now we're celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the establishment of the National Building Performance Standards Coalition. And we have over 40 localities between states and municipalities who have joined the coalition to step up as leaders for building performance standards. This represents about a quarter of all commercial and multifamily buildings square footage in our country, and we can do even better. What we're going to hear about today are different approaches to establishing BPS in your community. And what I think is really, really crucial with this coalition is the opportunity to learn from each other. You're the leaders. It's only through the application of BPS in your communities that you are learning how to address our existing buildings in a way that is equitable, that reduces utility costs, improve health, and that works for owners. And we have an opportunity to learn from each other. Use this network and this coalition as a chance to grow and also to help others figure out what to do with their buildings. We need you, or we're not going to get to this, start really dramatically reducing those 30% emissions. With that, I wanted to say that the coalition is going to be able to provide resources to help you. EPA and Department of Energy are also available to help you get through this process. Many of you have received assistance already through them. And really exciting is that we finally have some bigger sources of funding available to help you get through the process. So there is going to be a webinar about this later this spring, but I wanted to call attention to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is groundbreaking climate change funding, and also the infrastructure bill that was passed. Right now on the street, this coming year, it's going to be funding to help building owners, but there's also funding available today for you as in terms of developing codes. So right now there's $45 million available through the infrastructure bill for helping with code development, and that can include BPS. There's also the Energy Efficiency Community Block Grant that is currently on the street right now, and that can also be used for developing BPS. And there's going to be $1 billion worth of funding coming out very soon from Department of Energy to support code development, including zero emissions codes. Take advantage of these opportunities to help you staff up and really make a difference in your communities in terms of reducing emissions. So with that, I just wanted to say how deeply grateful we are for your leadership, and looking forward to talking to you more and seeing how much further we can get in terms of addressing our existing buildings and making commitments across this country. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heather. All right. Again, thank you so much, Heather, for joining today and providing the context for the coalition. And I also do want to add that the coalition continues to grow. We recently just, found out that Minneapolis and the city of Berkeley have joined the coalition. So I know there are a lot of jurisdictions right now who are here on this call that are interested or seriously considering about joining the National BPS Coalition and arming yourselves with the resources it can bring. Reach out to us and reach out to the White House. We're going to continue to follow up with cities that are really interested in this coalition. So thanks again, Heather. I'm going to talk a little bit now about IMT's approach, but as I'm talking about IMT's approach to how we think about BPS and its broader picture, we're going to drop a couple of polls in the, right now, 2 polls. Like, tell us, what industry are you in and working in right now, as well as are you working in or for a jurisdiction that has a BPS right now? So, take some time to fill those out as I'm going through this next section. All right, so this graphic that you see right here, this was developed as part of the American Cities Climate Challenge, a philanthropic initiative that many cities who are on this call may have been a part of. And during my time with the city of St. Louis, we were one of those ACCC cities. And it was a multi-year effort to accelerate local climate action in buildings and transportation. And one of the two components, or two components that are intrinsically tied together are both equity goals and climate goals. And when we think about that, it goes into IMT's approach. And a key part of that approach is supporting frontline communities, which we define, many of you folks are familiar with frontline communities, but for those who are not, it's those who experience the most immediate and worst impacts of climate change. And those tend to be our most marginalized and pushed to the side community members, communities of color, Indigenous folks, and low-income communities. So when we think of a BPS policy, it has to be, and it should be organized around community needs, and it should prioritize a couple of essential equity imperatives. 1, understanding and listening to community priorities. 2, not causing harm. And 3, making sure that we're actually doing some good in these communities with our partners with government and businesses. And in order to achieve those goals, we must have an inclusive process throughout and to consider potential unintended consequences. Such as rent increases or disproportionately burdening frontline communities. So in terms of putting it in practicality, what we're saying is that BPS is bigger than just about energy or reducing carbon emissions. This slide that you see right here, the top concerns for a lot of frontline communities are often things related to health, climate emergencies, health, and affordability. And these areas of concern are also relevant to businesses, which should care and also care about health costs and associated with their workforce development. So by creating a BPS that can make improvements in these areas, we can advance both those items that I mentioned earlier, climate and equity goals, as well as build trust between governments, businesses, and frontline communities. So this beautiful infographic that you see right here, it gives you a roadmap, and that roadmap includes a series of steps about creating an inclusive and equitable BPS policy, which requires, again, community members at every stage. That's something you're going to hear a lot during today's presentation, is the centering of community needs in a BPS. And it's something that here at IMT that we advocate for, and we try and shift governments to think differently in working with their communities. So our approach is, again, it's centered in community needs throughout the whole process. And the reason for that is because we have to think of holistic solutions that support not just our niche buildings, but how we're improving the lives of people. And today's webinar in particular will be focusing on that circle that you see right there, policy implementation, taking the years of research and knowledge that we've done in a lot of BPS cities, and providing that in a BPS implementation guide. So I'm going to hand it off now to Cliff, who can give more of that technical overview of some of the policy considerations for BPS implementation.
Thank you, Rajiv, and thank you all for coming here today. And thanks also, you can see some of our key resources here on the screen, and many of you helped us develop these resources. These take advantage of the best practices from early adopter jurisdictions that have building performance standards. We consulted with experts from the communities, experts in equity, experts in real estate, building owners, and others, and all of their input helped improve our drafts. In particular, with respect to our model building performance standard law, we received 25 pages of suggestions on our draft model law from the real estate roundtable, and incorporated many of their suggestions, and it greatly strengthened our model law. So I thank all of you who helped build these documents, and they are living documents. They're constantly evolving as we learn more. So I invite all of you to download them, to give us feedback, and to tell us what else belongs in them, or what changes we should make. And you can send that directly to me. I'm cliff@imt.org. Let me take a step back for a moment, though, and say how this started. So we helped write the first ever building performance standard, or BEPS, as we call it sometimes, in Washington, D.C. back in 2018. And we also worked with some of the other early adopter jurisdictions. And then more jurisdictions came to us and they said, we're looking at adopting a building performance standard. Can you help us? And that prompted us to create our model building performance standard law that is intended to help jurisdictions that are developing. It's actually in legal language, and it's the starting point that most jurisdictions that are adopting new BEPS use as their starting point. And most recently, for instance, Massachusetts, there's a bill adopted in the Massachusetts state legislature that tracks pretty closely with our model BEPS law. And so this is a service that we offer to jurisdictions, and we're happy to work with folks on this. We don't expect anyone is going to just take it without having a real conversation with us, and that's what we're here for, is to help people write and implement these laws. And so on the topic of implementation, you can see on the left of the screen our new implementation guide, which is an 85-page guide to best practices covering some of the topics that we're going to be covering today, how does a jurisdiction assure that the law doesn't just look nice on paper, but is actually translating into real improvement on the ground, making people's lives better, delivering cost-effective, equitable building decarbonization. So let me talk now about an innovation which is at the heart of our model law, and that's the trajectory approach. What you can see here is a graphic illustration with 3 example buildings. The vertical axis is building energy use, but it could be other metrics like water use, for instance, and those are covered in our model law. The horizontal axis is time. You would start with a baseline year, say 2022, and go all the way out to a final performance year, and that would be well into the future, 20 plus years into the future, ideally. So say that's 2045. And then at intervals of about 5 years, we recommend interim standards. And that's a period by which a building must achieve a certain building performance standard. We recommend about every 5 years because that lines up well with the typical capital planning cycle that building owners have. And we also recommend that because it's not enough just to have a long-term goal. We know that building owners need to know that immediate action is needed. It's not going to be a problem that they can just leave for the next person who's responsible for that building. So in this example, we have 3 buildings. Building A starts out using the most energy. And so it is required to improve at the fastest rate, because as you can see, all of the lines converge at the right. That is the final building performance standard. Every building of a particular type, and in this example, say they're all offices, or they could all be multifamily or retail or something else. But you're comparing apples to apples. Every building of a particular type is required to achieve the same final performance standard in that year, which is 20 plus years out in the future. So building A is required to improve at the fastest rate and reach the same final performance standard as all other buildings. But in every interim period, it is permitted to use more energy. We recognize that buildings start in different places, that a one-size-fits-all approach may not work best, that in this way we can more equitably distribute the level of effort across all building owners, so that those that start off using the most energy are required to improve fastest, but are permitted to use more in the interim period, knowing that it takes a long time to make big improvements in buildings. Another important aspect of this is providing long-term certainty. Right from the beginning, a building owner will know exactly how well that building has to perform every 5 years, going 20 plus years out. That kind of long-term certainty is important when you're looking for building owners to make investments in long-lived assets, assets like heat pumps that have a 30-plus year lifetime. So if a building owner is going to put a lot of money into buying new heat pumps and installing them, they want to know that those heat pumps are going to put their building on trajectory to be in compliance with a building performance standard across the life of that heat pump. And that's what this is all about. It's about providing that long-term certainty. We know that long-term certainty is likely to lead to bigger investments, which means bigger climate greenhouse gas reductions, bigger job creation, bigger equity benefits sooner. So equity is an important part of this process. Another important aspect is that we know that building owners know their buildings best. So a building performance standard is not a prescriptive requirement. Building owners can choose what improvements they will make. And they also have some flexibility around timing to accommodate events like end of life of equipment, tenant turnover, refinancing mortgages. Those events are often very opportune times to make improvements to buildings. And you can make the same or better improvements at lower cost than at other times. So we're providing that flexibility while also providing the urgency that the climate crisis requires, incentivizing building owners to take early action. So we recognize, though, that buildings don't improve in straight lines. Buildings in the real world, they look more like the dotted line that you see here. And this is just one notional example. In this example, building owner puts in place lighting upgrades and a building tune-up in the first compliance cycle. That improves the building's performance enough that it's in compliance at the first interim period. Then they make an envelope upgrade that improves the building's performance enough that it's in compliance for the second period. Finally, they make a mechanical upgrade that puts the building in compliance through the final performance standard. This is just one example. Each building owner will decide what measures that make the most sense for that building and those occupants and what sequence to put them in. But this is just to illustrate how the improvements will actually work on the ground, and not to imply that we have some unrealistic idea that buildings improve in straight lines. As long as the dotted line is below the straight line at every interim period, that building is in compliance and there's no problem. And that's how the vast majority of buildings will comply. But we know that there are edge cases, buildings with unusual circumstances that need to be treated differently. And that's why we've created the Building Performance Action Plan. It provides an escape valve for those buildings that do have unusual limitations due to factors outside of the owner's control. And so they have the ability to propose to the jurisdiction an alternative plan, a plan that, in this case, for instance, the building will be using more energy than would normally be permitted in interim standard 2. And that plan would lay out exactly what improvements the building will make, when those improvements will be made, and what level of performance those improvements will yield. And it will also lay out why the building is unusual and can't just comply with the regular trajectory. After doing all that, the jurisdiction will review that plan and they can approve that plan. If the jurisdiction approves the plan, it becomes a binding agreement between the owner and the jurisdiction. And so long as the building performs as laid out in the plan on a timely basis, that building will be in full compliance. So this provides an escape valve, recognizes that some buildings need special treatment, and it allows for a building performance building performance standards that are more ambitious, that are not designed to the lowest common denominator. So that plan, though, takes a lot of work. It's one of many elements of a building performance standard that takes a lot of work and expertise to implement. And so then the question is, how does a jurisdiction pay for it? Next slide. Well, when you're thinking about staffing your building performance standard, you want to develop your plan up front. You want to develop the plan as part of the policy design because it's so important. If you just pass a law without having a plan for how you're going to implement it, without having adequate resources, it's just a piece of paper. In fact, it can be worse than a piece of paper. It can undermine the credibility of your jurisdiction. So as part of any building performance standard design and development process, you need to think about how much staff is going to be required to implement this law, and where am I going to find that staff and those resources. For instance, in St. Louis, they added 3 staff at the same time that they adopted their building performance standard law. That was their legislation provided that additional appropriation. In Washington, D.C., they added 7 full-time equivalents, FTEs, along with their building performance standard law. Now, other jurisdictions have the benefit of learning from the early adopters and so may require less resources. And there are ways that you can design your building performance standard to streamline the work. For instance, the building performance action plans. You want to set the standard low enough that most buildings can meet it without having to submit a building performance action plan. And you want to require enough documentation that you'll discourage building owners that don't really need it from submitting plans, because we know that reviewing and processing and implementing those plans is time consuming. So reducing the number of plans will reduce the amount of work. So as part of any plan, you need to budget for what people are going to be doing what work, who needs to be hired, who needs to be reassigned from their existing positions, and also evaluate whether there are key functions that are best done outside of your organization. For instance, information technology is often best outsourced. There are firms that are now specializing in supporting things like building performance standards and benchmarking laws. What we're doing now is we're curating a collection of sample requests for proposals, RFPs, and contracts with those outsourced vendors. So I invite any of you that are on this call who haven't already shared your RFPs or contracts with us, please send them to us. Again, I'm cliff@imt.org, but we don't want anyone to have to reinvent a wheel. We don't want people to have to write an RFP from scratch when one of their peers may already have a great RFP or contract that can save them a lot of work. So then the question is, how are you going to pay for this? Well, there is a funding stream that's likely to come from building performance standards, and that is alternative compliance payments, which is the consequence for building owners that don't achieve the standard. But the goal must be to minimize those alternative compliance payments. We want to help building owners to succeed, to improve their buildings so that they don't have to make those payments. And it's important that building owners believe that building owners don't think of this as a hidden tax on them. So you can't really plan for a lot of those alternative compliance payments, and they're not going to come in until a few years into the implementation. So jurisdictions are realistically, in most cases, going to have to budget real money from their own funds up front to implement these building performance standards. And it's critically important that that happen. Now, if you're concerned about whether or how you'll find those funds, please come to IMT. We'll work with jurisdictions to help explore funding opportunities and what the funding needs will be, and design a plan to put something in place that works for you. Now, the good news is that there's also some new federal funds. As Heather announced early in this call, there are new federal funds coming from a variety of places, but most notably from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also known as the IIJA, and the Inflation Reduction Act. And that creates a number of pots of money, many of which can help the jurisdictions to implement building performance standards and building owners and others to improve their buildings so as to comply with building performance standards. The pots of money go to very many different places. Probably the agency with the most money that is relevant in this context is the U.S. Department of Energy. They have formulaic money like the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grants that's available to individual localities, tribes, and states, as well as the State Energy Program money, and that's generally allocated on a population basis. There's also lots of competitive money that's available. Some of it is earmarked for things like schools and nonprofits and critical infrastructure, and you heard at the top from Heather about the building code. There's now a resilient and efficient codes initiative. And if anybody is interested, we're putting together a proposal on that. If your government is interested in working with us on that, please contact us. And a host of funding available from the federal government. A lot of the money that's going to be competitively available, the rules haven't been written yet, so stay tuned, and we'll work with you and alert our partners as those funding opportunity announcements come out. The Environmental Protection Agency probably has the most money, and a lot of that money is happily targeted at climate justice, at frontline communities that have been hurt first and worst by climate change, redlining, and environmental injustice of siting of facilities and other problems. So there's money available directly to help governments implement. There's money available to community-based organizations, and there's money that will be lended out and will need to be repaid. Other agencies, including the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and Agriculture, have funds for public housing and for rural communities. And lastly, there's lots of new tax incentives that will help commercial building owners and put in renewables and electric vehicles. So there's a lot of new funding that's either already available or in most cases will soon become available as rules are written. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Rajiv.
Thanks, Cliff. Thanks for giving us that context. That is a lot of context, I'll be honest. And we don't want that to be overwhelming. So we want to bring it back to the people. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the people side of what it actually takes to implement and structure out an effective BPS. So on this slide that you see right here, this can be found in chapter 1 of our BPS implementation guide, the chapter that's titled Administrative Structure. And at the heart of it is what we call the implementing department, ultimately the local government or state government agency responsible for the administrative and enforcement of a BPS. You know, a technical subcommittee that you see here on the slide may be familiar, but there are 2 other entities that IMT recommends that are a bit newer. One called a Community Accountability Board, and the other a Building Performance Improvement Board, which I'll talk to in a little bit. But you know, one of the reasons that we are having this presentation today and having a series is to also shine a light and show gratitude to the jurisdictions that share their innovations with us that we can put into resources like a BPS implementation guide and work with more cities on a BPS. That Building Performance Improvement Board was something that was created during my time when I was working for the city of St. Louis, and that advisory board has been so far very foundational and a key element in how St. Louis has been implementing its BPS. So I'm going to spend a little time on this one, a Community Accountability Board. I think a lot of folks have heard this in principle, but we have a narrow view of how we want to apply or not a narrow view, but a specific view of how a Community Accountability Board can work with a jurisdiction when it comes to a BPS policy. And the goal of a Community Accountability Board is to shift ownership of policy and outcomes directly to community and community members. So as I'm talking about this, we're going to drop one more poll in here. We want to find out what are the challenges you're experiencing when creating and supporting a Community Accountability Board. So again, here at IMT, how we define frontline communities are those that suffer climate change the first and worst. And this is a critical element of our model law. When we recommend and work with jurisdictions on a BPS, this is something that we recommend each BPS has. Boston right now is implementing something very similar to a Community Accountability Board. But right now, it's early days for this concept. So we want to see how this continues to develop and how we can actually shift power to community members and community boards like this. Now, you know, the main reason for this is to establish accountability for buildings subject to BPS and policymakers. But beyond that, from a global aspect, it's never comfortable to shift power. This is a concept that we're talking about that is more than just status quo. It's vitally important, and it's absolutely necessary to achieve just outcomes, and something that we recommend, again, strongly as an organization, that jurisdictions work with their community members to consider this concept when you're pursuing a BPS. So this next slide right here is talking about the other side for the administrative entities needed for BPS implementation, a building performance improvement board. So typically this entity is meant to advise the department, the implementing department, on BPS. They can have duties that range from recommending final standards to the department, recommending complementary programs, reviewing appeals of alternative compliance plans for BPS. And they're made up of representatives that have an expertise in commercial buildings, real estate, building science, affordable housing, labor background, trades background. In St. Louis, the body is made up of nine representatives in its iterative board. Some boards can be smaller, some boards can be larger. It really depends on what is most effective for the implement agency that will liaison with such a board. And in addition to these entities, there's also a key entity that is typically outside of government that can provide a lot more resources to building owners from the resource adequacy side, whereas jurisdictions will typically be that compliance resource for BPS policy. And that's what you see here, high performance building hubs, which Marla is going to talk a bit about.
Thanks so much, Rajiv. So we understand that planning for a BPS policy implementation can be a little daunting, particularly related to engagement, like with all the companies and the building owners and people involved. And of course, building owners and vendors will have lots of questions that, local jurisdictions often don't have those internal resources to manage the program all on their own. But this should not be a barrier. The creation of a high-performance building hub that is separate from but works directly with the local jurisdiction is a solution that's really proven to be successful. So currently there are hubs in DC, New York City, Kansas City, Missouri, St. Louis, Denver, and one currently underway in Chicago. So a hub provides a one-stop shop for regulatory guidance, technical assistance, training opportunities, educational resources, as well as connecting to really critical things like financing solutions, available incentives, and locally skilled vendors. So everything that building owners need to create and operate high performance buildings is accessible and all in one place. And building owners love having one place that they can trust, that they know they can get accurate information and get all their questions answered in order to be successful. A hub also accelerates local capacity, plus the hub is also flexible to meet the needs and priorities of that specific local jurisdiction, since there can certainly be different priorities based on the location. There's also an opportunity for your hubs to become part of a larger network of hubs. And this is designed for knowledge sharing and understanding of lessons learned from others who have gone before. So also something to note, IMT created and currently runs the DC Innovation Hub, which supports the very first BPS implemented in the US. So we have great expertise in this area. And we can help develop a hub that is created from scratch or can be working with an existing local nonprofit. But it's a great way to augment limited funding and ensure the program gets the support that it needs to be successful. So make sure you take a look at Chapter 8 of the BPS Implementation Guide so you can find more detailed information about a building performance hub. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ben.
Thank you, Marla. I'm going to talk briefly on implementation considerations for jurisdictions working on building performance standards. One key is effective and reliable data management. BPS is a policy primarily built on and around the collection of a large amount of building energy and emissions data over time. So developing effective IT solutions is important for implementation success. We at IMT believe, and we explore in our implementation guide, that centralizing your IT needs into a single building performance policy software system will ease management of compliance tracking, data storage, and stakeholder outreach and engagement. Such a software solution should aim to provide three main services. Firstly, it should effectively collect, store, and manage data from covered buildings. This can function as the primary BPS compliance administration mechanism and tracking system. With that data, it can then be exported to some form of public-facing data portal. This can assist in data transparency to cover buildings and other stakeholders. Such a data access portal can function as a one-stop shop for owners to understand the building's performance relative to standards, easing overall compliance and information sharing. And lastly, it should have the functionality and connectivity with some form of customer relations management software platform. This streamlines and organizes tracking of interaction with building owners and partners while allowing for easily accessible building data points for jurisdictional staff to improve processes and support compliance. Next, I want to speak on the role of enforcement measures in BPS compliance. While ideally, all building owners should be working actively to improve their efficiency and decarbonize their buildings, we know some might fall behind or be slow to move. To that end, a BPS can only be as effective as its enforcement measure is. BPS can be the most powerful tool for jurisdictions in mitigating climate change from existing buildings, but that is only so long as enforcement isn't just a slap on the wrist. IMT recommends and details in our implementation guide that the primary enforcement mechanism should be built around what we call an alternative compliance payment structure. An ACP allows for a building to comply with BPS if they pay an amount calculated based on the extent to which it has missed its performance targets. We think that an ACP, as the name for the enforcement structure, is superior to fines or fees, and it allows for more flexibility for jurisdictions in setting enforcement amount. It's easier to earmark monies derived for specific equitable decarbonization funds, and aligns with normal commercial landlord-tenant lease agreements by allowing commercial owners to better distribute costs under many commercial leases. And now with that, I'll pass it back to Rajiv.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to talk a little bit about the coordination, both internally and as well as externally for governments, and as well as talking about within that implementing jurisdiction, how to coordinate in developing its BPS implementation structure. So what you see right here on the slide kind of gives an ecosystem, an overview of the kind of entities that a government is going to have to interact with both internally and outside. And there's going to be a lot of players involved, and some of these may be existing in your jurisdiction or your state right now, and some may not be. Cliff and Marla have already talked about how, for example, there are jurisdictions that have a BPS and already resourced with a network of hubs, St. Louis and DC, for example, and New York. So what this is meant to show is that the more complex and the more stringent a policy can be, there's going to be a greater need for coordination with a lot of governmental departments and entities. Buildings departments and sustainability/resilience offices are the implementing departments that we've typically seen in the 11 jurisdictions that currently have a BPS in North America. There's going to be work with potentially monitoring what the state does in the matter of preemption. I see that was coming up a lot in the chat, or someone brought up the mention of preemption. Keep rolling in with the questions, because these are the kind of things that we want to hear, as well as also remind you guys that we're going to go into a lot of these deeper dives based on these questions in those topics that I mentioned earlier. So, from this slide, there's probably one entity that you're wondering is outside of government that's not being represented here, and that's utilities. Now, utilities right here, I also want to spend a little time right here on utilities because of just the influence that they have in a lot of jurisdictions that are working on a BPS. They play a key role in its implementation, and more importantly, to adjust transition to electrification. The chapter that I talked about before is chapter 6 of our guide, and it coincides with this utilities work, which is found in chapter 7 of our BPS implementation guide. Governments, businesses, community members, community partners can use this time and can use BPS as an opportunity to open a conversation with utilities and engage with them on the topics that you see here on the slide. So things like redirecting incentives towards frontline communities who experience unfair energy burdens, driving greater utility investment in the grid to improve resilience and flexibility. So what we're trying to convey here right now is that BPS offers jurisdictions, communities, and businesses the power to reform utilities in a way to shift their thinking on how equity has to be designed in each of these topic areas that you see here before you. Now, we're going to round out the presentation part and jump into answering some of the questions that you guys have been putting in the chat. And yes, they are a lot of questions, and that's exactly what we wanted. What you see here is just a teaser, a tip of the iceberg of the kind of resources that we have at IMT, and specifically at imt.org/BPS. We have a lot of policy briefs, we have a lot of social priority briefs, but what's most important is that we have the people that can work with you guys on these kind of policies. We have the experience, the case studies, the relationships, and beyond to help you succeed on your building decarbonization goals. But this is, a very nuanced and big policy. It's meant to be overwhelming, but I think you can take solace from the fact that there are groups like IMT that are willing and wanting to work with you. This is why we show up to work every day. Problem solving and working through all this nuance is fun for us. I know a lot of this stuff is dry, but this is legitimately fun for us. And we're investing in ourselves here at IMT. All of our sections of community engagement, our policy team, and our business engagement team are growing because we want to deploy the right people and the right amount of people and resources in the burgeoning coalition that is the National BPS Coalition. So, with that said, BPS is the most powerful tool for decarbonizing existing buildings, and we want to be able to hear from you all on how we can continue to work together and find the ways to meet that goal for your state or local government. So I think we're going to transition now to our Q&A, and I think some of our IMTers from behind the scenes are going to pull out some specific questions that our panelists and speakers will be able to talk about.
Thanks, Rajiv, and thank you to everyone who submitted great questions. I did my best to keep up, but I was running out of time at the end. So we will try to follow up with you after the presentation if we don't get to you in the next couple of minutes. There were a couple of questions sort of around community priorities and equity in the BPS process. So one question in particular, how can you include community priorities in a BPS policy? Can you talk about an example and who represents the community in these conversations? And I thought I would ask that question of Ben. Maybe you could share kind of what Boston did as an example. And then there's a follow-up on that, which I'm going to direct at Cliff. So kind of a two-parter.
Sure. So I think the Boston BPS policy is probably exemplary in this space, where Boston engaged in a very thoroughgoing community engagement process, bringing in local frontline communities, environmental justice, community-based organizations, and residents into the policy design process itself. And some of the key concerns that were raised from community members was, firstly, and most importantly, affordability and concerns around displacement. But also real concerns around air quality and asthma rates, especially in some neighborhoods such as Chinatown and the South End in Boston. And the ways in which that was integrated into the policy, one was the construction of their version of the Community Accountability Board, the Boston's review board, that gave a significant amount of power and authority to community-based organizations representing these frontline communities in overseeing of the policy and distributing funds derived from the policy to help alleviate displacement pressures. But also within the policy is a requirement that the city tracks and discloses certain air quality measures over time, and tries and reports on the overall impact of the policy through a lens of both the air quality as well as the overall displacement and affordability impacts of it. So those are some ways in which jurisdictions can take these into account. And I just wanted to do a shout out. We have IMT has a number of social briefs that dive into things such as resiliency, air quality, and affordability as they relate to building performance standards.
Thanks, Ben. And the follow-up question was sort of, Cliff, you talked a little bit about the process for soliciting feedback into our resources at the beginning. Can you talk about kind of the range of stakeholders that were included in that process?
Sure. Thank you, Jessica, and thanks for the question. So we try to consult with the broadest possible range. And again, centering equity as a North Star to guide our work. So we wanted to work with community-based organizations, with equity experts, with folks who focus on addressing racial injustice. And we're very proud of what came out of that process. We got a lot of great suggestions, which became things like the Community Accountability Board, and we've received a lot of positive feedback. It is already, that concept is already being used in places like Boston. And we, of course, we need to talk to experts across every category, government experts who are writing these laws, who are implementing these laws, who are considering it. And as we've worked closely with many jurisdictions in writing their laws, we've helped them and they've helped us. It's a bilateral process. And we're helping to sort of create communities of learning, communities of practitioners of jurisdictions and others. Certainly practitioners like engineers and consultants, energy auditors and others have lots of insight about how things actually work in practice and how unintended consequences can result if you don't design a policy carefully. And utilities have a lot of insight, and folks, consultants and others who are working with utilities. Utilities, as you heard from Rajiv, play a really important role. Lenders and sources of capital are important. Even folks like appraisers, and making sure that when you're looking at valuing a building, you're considering how it compares against a building performance standard, and that's factored into every transaction. So every step in the process is important. And we've tried, we have a very interdisciplinary approach, and we've tried to factor in as much of this expertise as we can. And we're, again, grateful to all of the experts on this call and elsewhere who've lent us their expertise. And as I say, they're open documents, they're living documents. I would invite anybody to read them and let us know how we can make them better. Our goal is to constantly evolve them and improve them.
Thanks, Cliff. I know we're coming to run out of time, but there was one question, Heather, since we have you here, around interest in joining the National BPS Coalition. So I wonder if you could speak to that. I did direct folks to the National BPS Coalition website. There's a contact us form, but anything else you want to share?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. We are really excited about the idea of more municipalities and more states joining. So in terms of the process for that, IMT can be really supportive in terms of helping you figure out the steps to join and the resources that are going to be available. Our office is also happy to have conversations to provide additional support there as well. We are going to be working more and more with municipalities and states to get more engagement, and we'd love to see more folks join this coalition.
Thanks, Heather. I know we are at time, so Rajiv, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
I think we can take, we still have, looks like we still have 134. I think if we can take one more question, and then I will close this out and let the folks know what next steps are in terms of how we'll reach back out to you.
Okay. So it sounds like if you need to drop off, if you have a couple minutes. I was going to bring up, there was a question in the chat about sort of the integration of benchmarking laws and BPS. So we know benchmarking data is fundamental to crafting a solid building performance standard. Cliff, I see you have your hand raised. I wonder if you could just speak broadly on that topic.
Sure. Yeah, benchmarking laws and building performance standards go hand in hand. In order to set targets, especially long-term targets for buildings, you need to have really good data about how buildings are performing now and how they can realistically perform in the future. And obviously, it's really hard to predict the future. There will be new technologies that will make it easier and cheaper to improve buildings. So you're going to have to extrapolate from some of that. So in a perfect world, and what we've seen is most of the building performance standards that have been passed, the jurisdiction already had a benchmarking law that it could rely on in setting those standards. That includes jurisdictions like New York and Washington, D.C. and Denver and Boston. But we also are hearing from jurisdictions, so that's what we recommend. Certainly benchmarking needs to be part of it. But there are some jurisdictions like Washington State that have adopted benchmarking and BEPS at the same time. And sometimes they phase the benchmarking to come a little bit earlier. And then there's a couple-year delay before the building performance standard kicks in. And I think that's a good strategy as well. And if you're going to have to pass a lot of policies that make fundamental changes to your built environment, probably best to package them all together and think about them all rather than going through that trauma twice. Now, we've heard from jurisdictions that say, well, there's a climate crisis. We have really ambitious climate commitments that we have to hit by, say, 2030. We don't have time to put in a benchmarking law, wait 3 or 4 years, and then put in building performance standards, even if it's all packaged together. And so that was somewhat the case in Washington State, and it certainly is in other jurisdictions. And in those circumstances, sometimes there's adequate data available. The U.S. Department of Energy and the national labs are providing analysis. You can use data. In the case of Washington State, they used benchmarking data from Seattle, which already had a benchmarking law in place. You can use data from surrounding jurisdictions. You can use data from voluntary, including utility programs that are yielding data about building performance. There's also many buildings, a huge number are already voluntarily using the Energy Star tool and sharing Energy Star certified buildings. Their information is all available, their performance. So there's a lot of sources. And in some cases, buildings can develop their building performance standards relying on those sources and then set the targets, the requirements before they even get their first benchmarking data. It's not ideal, but given the urgency of the climate crisis and the availability of expertise from the U.S. Department of Energy and others, it's very much a workable solution.
Great, thanks, Cliff. So I think we'll do one more question and then maybe wrap it up. I see people are dropping off, but thanks to those of you who have stayed on. So last, I'm gonna elevate one of the questions that was on the implementation side. So this one's for you, Marla. How do you think about sort of piggybacking, someone asked, resources when it comes to BPS implementation and kind of the hub concept that you talked about earlier?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So that's one of the things that we really address in the network of hubs, or that we call the BPP, Building Performance Partnership. So IMT is partnered with the Building Energy Exchange in New York to run the network of hubs. And that's one of the real benefits of a hub being formed and then joining the network, because that way there is some sharing of some basic resources, but sometimes, you know, there's maybe MOUs and things that we do to work together to make sure maybe one resource that was created specifically for, you know, one jurisdiction needs to be adapted for the other one. But the good news is we can do it very cost effectively and easily because the resource is already created. So it's just a great place to where you can start with something that already exists, in addition to just all the context around it, what works, what could be done better. So the network of hubs is really designed for that, for the optimization of resources and sharing and the knowledge base. So that's what I would recommend around that. And the best place to do that is through the network of hubs.
All right. Well, thank you guys for your questions. Thank you guys for your participation. Thanks for the 90 of you that have stayed a little bit past the hour. We appreciate that. So again, my name is Rajiv Ravulapati. For the jurisdictions that still may be on here, you'll be hearing from me, you'll be hearing from our policy team, but we also, again, want to hear from you guys. Again, this is just a kickoff one. As you can see from even just a high level, BPS is a powerful but yet complex policy. And it's easy to get overwhelmed or think of it as daunting, but that's why we have the expertise and the knowledge to be able to share back with you guys. So we're going to share our BPS implementation guide. as a follow-up as well as a survey after today's webinar. But to the staff, to our presenters, to all of you who have participated today and wanted to learn more about how BPS can be a right fit for your city, for your community, and understanding that it's the most powerful policy for decarbonizing buildings. Thank you guys again for attending. We'll talk to you soon.